Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking about how to get good letters of recommendation for whatever purpose you need one for. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Career Conference. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about how to get good letters of recommendation, whether you need them for your law school application, clerkship applications, jobs, and so on. So it seems like fundamentally there are two issues here. One is who you ask, and two, what information do they need to do the best possible job for you? So Alison, should we start with talking about who to ask first? How do you know if someone's going to be a good recommender and if they're even willing to help you? We want them, of course, to write a strong letter of recommendation. We don't want a mediocre one.
No, and I think that's a really, really key point. I think it can be awkward for a lot of people to sort of figure out who they're going to ask and to make the ask. But one of the things you really have to keep in mind is you've got to find somebody who's going to give you a stellar letter of recommendation. So, when we talk about who's a good recommender, sometimes students think, oh, I need like the most prestigious professor or the biggest name professor. And that's great. But that person really also needs to know you and be willing to go to bat on your behalf. Because, behind the scenes, I definitely saw when I was clerking, sometimes letters would come in, from applications from our school or whatever, and the judge might be like, oh, do you know this person? And sometimes they would bring in the letters of recommendation, and it might be a really big name professor, but the letter was actually terrible, and that's going to sink your chances at a job like that.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting in our other podcast episodes on, resume writing, cover letter writing, and stuff like that. We talk about how you kind of set yourself apart, right? And how you kind of tell your story. And I think that these letters of recommendation are just another way that your story gets told. If you sound interesting, if the person is interested to write about you, if they have a connection with you, that's going to make your application stand out. If it's just basically a template letter of recommendation that they change the name on, it's not really it doesn't matter whose name's on it.
Right.
It's not really going to do anything.
I've seen letters that are basically like, yes, this person got an A in the class. And it's like, well, you know that from the transcript. What are you adding?
Right.
Maybe it's a big name professor and maybe you got an A, but that person might not be the right recommender for you.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important question is to start evaluating who you can actually ask. And do they even have anything to say about you? Do they know you? Do you have a relationship with them?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, sometimes you can also be strategic in terms of, say, you need 3 or 4 letters of recommendation. It might be fine to have one, that's that big name, like really well-known professor, whether it's undergrad or law school, the person who shows up in the newspaper and all the stuff that people are going to have heard of. It might be fine if their if their letter is essentially, I had this person in my class, they did really well, they seem like a nice person, whatever. That's not going to be the strongest letter on earth, but it might still have some bearing coming from that person. But that means your other letters really have to be personal.
Right.
This has to be someone who has worked closely with you, whether it might be, if you're an undergraduate, like on an honors project or something like that. If you're in law school, maybe you wrote a note and this person was your note advisor. Or, you TA'd for someone and they're going to give you that letter of recommendation, or you did a clinic. But you've got to have somebody who actually really knows you.
Yeah, I think that that's completely right. And is interested in this path for you. I remember one of the professors one of my undergrad professors who wrote a letter of recommendation for me is a JD PhD. And although he wasn't necessarily the professor who I had the most interaction with all through school, we'd kept in touch. He knew I was going to law school. He was excited that I was going to law school. We did have a relationship while I was on campus. And he wrote a really great letter of recommendation, partly because he's excited about his students attending law school as well, you know?
And I think that's something to keep in mind. Does this person have the context that they can go to and say, like, yes, I believe that this person, knowing what I know, as a JD, PhD, I know what it takes to succeed as a lawyer or to succeed as a law student. I mean, they don't have to say that outright in the letter, but it's pretty obvious.
Right.
So, and exactly. I understand the characteristics that are required for success in this field, and I believe that Ms. Burgess has these characteristics. Let me tell you more about that.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking about who to ask, I think that's a great point. Does this person have the requisite background? If it's a law professor, like, did they clerk? Can they say something about, like, well, when I was a clerk, I know that these are the skills that are required, and I feel like this person would do a great job. Mm-hmm. It's not just like, who are they? It's what do they know? What have they done? Like, what can they speak to, basically, with authority?
Right. And, are they excited about you? I mean, I think you do want, I know when people have asked me to write letters of recommendation, if it's someone that I'm really in their corner and I'm excited about what they're doing, it's such an easier letter to write. I realize that sometimes we just have to write letters of recommendations as part of the process of, if you're a professor or if you're in a leadership position and you're going to be helping out other folks. But if you have a relationship with someone and you believe in their path, it's much easier to write. So you definitely want to make sure that they think whatever you're doing is a good decision and an exciting opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, so the question is really like, how strongly do they support you? Mm-hmm. This is part of, like, how well do they know you? But, in some cases, like, you might not realize if someone doesn't actually like you that much. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things we'll talk about later is kind of how to make the ask and how to figure that out. But I think, people just need to be realistic about, is this someone who's really going to go to bat for me? Is this somebody who's going to make those phone calls, who's going to work their network to make this happen for me? Or is it someone who's just like, well, I was your professor, so I guess I have to say yes.
Right. Yeah.
And you want to be sensitive about who's really on your team and who's not here.
I think that's very true because, like you said, if they are not going to be on your team and cheering for you, may not be worth it to have you on.
Well, it's just like, your team. You just don't want a lukewarm letter of recommendation. That's not the point of these.
No.
These are not intended to be necessarily a fully objective version of you. This is intended to be your absolute best version of you with these people who are like, I would hire this person for anything.
Right.
If I could have the opportunity. That's the person you want writing the letter.
Yep, exactly. And then there's the practical thing. Does this person have the bandwidth and will they actually do it?
Oh, definitely. There's nothing like more of a nightmare than having like everything finished and ready to go and then having that one recommender who is just not getting your stuff done.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about how to sort of suss that out in advance? Like, how can you figure out if this is a slacker professor or not?
I think some professors, if you know them, it can be pretty clear who are the last minute professors. The professors who talk about writing their exams like the night before they have to turn them into the printer. I had those professors. Not to say that she wouldn't have written a great letter of recommendation, but she probably would have sent it or given it back to you the day that you have to have it sent back. And if you know that you are engaging that professor for this or that former boss or whatever, then you better have some sort of accountability structure to try and do some gentle nudging to make sure that it does get done. Because I think, really busy people and often very high performing people, stuff slips through the cracks.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk about this in detail later. But you've got to be realistic. Professors procrastinate just like everybody else. They get too busy. And also, students, frankly, ask too late a lot of the time. You don't want to be that person who rolls in like a week before your law school application is due to ask your professor if they can do a letter for you. You need to plan ahead on this stuff.
Yeah.
If you have that person who's always super flustered and never getting anything done and doesn't get comments on exams and doesn't turn in your grades on time, I think there's a pattern there. So, it's not to say that like you can't get them to do it, but you're just going to have to be aware that it probably will be a lot more stressful and a lot more work than the person who diligently shows up on time, does exactly what they say they're going to do on the syllabus, plans ahead. You can just tell a lot of time, like, what type of person you're dealing with.
Yeah, I think that's true. And then when you're picking these people, I think we've already mentioned it a little bit, but really sitting down with whatever application you're doing, whether it be a law school application, clerkship, job, other graduate school opportunity, whatever it might be, and think about your story and who these people are that can kind of support you in all of the areas that kind of tell your story. So for instance, when I applied to law school, I had worked for a while. So it would have been kind of weird if I had only submitted letters of recommendations from undergrad professors because they would have been like, what's she been doing for the last few years? And so it was kind of like my story was I still had relationships with these professors from undergrad, but then I definitely had a few different bosses from work who were able to vouch for what I was able to do outside of the classroom. I think that's important, and I think you need to think about what your story and application is and find the people that will support that story, because it's just going to make all of your experiences much more robust if you've got a variety of perspectives on the different things that you've done.
Right. And I also think you have to look at what you're being asked for. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know, as I recall, like a lot of law schools essentially said, like, you could have one letter from your work, but you really need to have, 2 or 3 letters from professors who've worked with you. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm trying to remember, because I had a weird background. I had worked and I also had gone to grad school. I think I had mostly like undergrad professors, but I really don't remember, to be honest.
I know I at least had 1 undergrad professor, maybe 2, and then I think I at least had 2 bosses.
Yeah, my boss hated me because I quit, so I definitely didn't have the
Well, I used bosses before the job that I took right before I applied to law school.
Yeah, I'd been doing the same job like between grad school and law school, and I knew that wasn't going to go well when I quit, which it didn't. They tried to fire me after I'd already quit. So I can't remember what I did, though. I mean, I might have had someone else there do one, or I might have just skipped it.
Yeah.
And I think maybe I can't even remember. I honestly don't remember what I did. But point being, you have choices, and you want to think about what are you pitching? Who are you pitching it to? I mean, I would caution people, if you've been out of school for a while, you cannot just send in letters of recommendation from your bosses. Like, you have to find someone who can talk to your academic ability if you're applying to law school. That's just kind of the bottom line.
Yeah.
Which can be hard if people have been out of school for a while. I mean,
they can, especially if you went to a large university where you didn't necessarily have a lot of interaction with professors. I think you have to maybe start a little on the early end and try and rekindle some of those relationships.
And it might mean, it might mean that you reach out to them and you're like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this 6 months before you actually need to apply. And then maybe say, hey, you may have forgotten me basically, but could we meet for coffee? I'll bring some of my own old work, that kind of thing. I mean, hopefully you have some of that. If you're listening to this and you're thinking maybe you'll apply to law school or something in the future, definitely keep in touch with these old professors. Keep your work. Yep. Let them know what you're up to. It's never going to be a bad idea, because, you do have to have that relationship, or otherwise what are they going to say?
It's so true. I mean, an email around the holiday season can go a long way.
Here's a little recap of what I've been doing.
Yeah, here's where I am. Here's what I'm doing.
Really appreciate all that thing that you did for me,
right.
Knowledge I gained in X class. I applied it this way in my job.
If you go to alumni events at your college, take that opportunity to try and go swing by professors' offices. Even if they're not there, you can send them a note saying you swung by. There are lots of opportunities to continue those relationships.
But you do, you do want to have these touch points with people. And if you're listening to this and you're not sure how to develop those relationships, take a class or take more than one class with the same professor, like try to work with them on something, try to be a TA, like volunteer together, whatever it takes to become more than just that random person who sat in the back of the room and never said anything and they did pretty well in the exam.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So now you figured out who to ask, or you have your pool of people that you want to ask. Now, what do you do to actually ask them? Do you just say in an email, hey, write me this letter of recommendation, it's due in a week? Because I've gotten those emails, by the way.
Yeah, that's probably not going to be that well received.
Yeah, no.
I mean, your ideal process is you start well in advance of when you need this. I personally think it's a good idea to try to set up a meeting and give them a heads up via email in advance about what you want to talk about. And the main reason for that is it kind of gives them a chance to sort of think about it, to kind of remember you, and to really think in their heads, like, okay, is this somebody that I would feel comfortable doing this for? Because if you spring that on someone in a meeting, I feel like that is not going to necessarily go that well.
It can be a little awkward.
Well, it's like they just, it's like, well, wait, why are you, say you're going to office hours as a law student and you just show up to office hours and you're like, hey, can you write me this letter of recommendation? I mean, maybe the answer is an enthusiastic yes, but maybe the professor's more like, oh, whoa, I thought we were going to be talking about personal jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like it's a good idea to sort of, just drop an email, hey, Professor Burgess, I'm thinking of doing, applying to this clerkship or whatever it is. I would love to have your support in a letter of recommendation. Could I come by your office and talk to you about it?
Yeah, I think that's really great. And then everybody has the expectations. And then the professor also knows to think about whether or not they have the bandwidth to do this for you before that meeting. So they also don't feel backed into a corner and maybe don't agree to do something they don't have time to do.
Yeah. And they, if they want to get out of it, they can think of a polite way to let you down.
Yeah. And I think it's also your job to go to that meeting and then really listen to whether or not they're willing to do it and be enthusiastic about it.
Yeah. And I think it's absolutely fine to ask that outright. Mm-hmm. Maybe you send the email and you get this like, yes, I'd love to do it. Like, come and talk to me. Or you might get nothing or, whatever, you go in and if they're kind of hemming and hawing and like, well, it's a really busy time in the semester for me. And I do have that committee that I'm on. And, I think it might be beneficial to just ask them outright, do you feel like you could give me a very strong letter, like given your bandwidth? And if they say no, well, great, because you actually found out that you don't want them as a recommender.
Right.
But I think you've got to give people an out. You've got to give them some graceful way to exit the situation if you sense that they are not enthusiastic.
I think that's right. And I think the professors would actually respect you for doing that.
Yeah, because a lot of people, professors are people, like they're reluctant to say no.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're not like, yes, I would love to do this enthusiastically, and like, where are you applying? What are you doing? What do I need to do? I think that's the sign that, something like, well, I understand you're really busy this semester and I realize you don't actually know me all that well. If you feel like maybe I should find someone else, I'd be happy to do that.
Right.
That's hard to say, but it's still better than having someone write you a bad letter that's going to basically tank whatever you're applying for.
Yeah. Or, have them write it, but then decide you don't want to use it and then somebody else use it. You just don't want to waste anyone's time.
No. And there may be some awkwardness, but you want somebody who's fully on board with you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So once you've decided that person is actually on board, how do you make sure that it gets done?
Well, that's like, the $26,000 question, right? Because lots of people agree to do something and all of their best intentions, and they don't actually end up doing it, or they don't end up doing it without a lot of hassle. I think like with most things, you've got to have a plan.
Mm-hmm.
Before you leave the room, I think you should try to agree on exactly what the next steps are.
Yeah, I agree. And that's, something that is really important and then should be written down by you on the notepad that you take to this meeting so that like you clearly understand as well what the next steps are.
Right. And you might even consider, I was in a meeting this morning with someone and they had their piece of paper and they actually wrote notes for me and they gave me those notes.
Oh, that's helpful.
So I left that meeting and I'm like, oh, wait, what were our next steps? What did I agree to? What was I supposed to do? What was like the price of this? And then I just look at the note they gave me and they had a note for them and a note for me. And, it actually worked out pretty well. I think in this case, it's not a bad idea to leave them kind of the next steps, but you probably also want to follow up in an email.
Yeah, laying out the next steps.
Yeah, and also, I think in the first meeting or, later if you forget, but sort of find out who you can follow up with. Because, a lot of professors, the person, that I TA'd for and did some letters for me, he was like, all right, I don't want to be bothered about this, but I can tell you now I'm going to wait until the last minute. So what you need to do is follow up weekly with my assistant and see if I've done it yet. And I was fine with that. I was like, great, I'll put a note on my calendar every Monday or every Friday. I will send an email to your assistant being like, has this professor started on my letter yet? And she'll write back and be like, no, he has not. I'm like, could you please follow up with him? Yes.
Right. Exactly.
You've got to be really clear on what people need to do, what their deadlines are. I got an email today, for example, like from my sister, who someone asked her to write a letter of recommendation, which is not what prompted this podcast, but and she's like, oh, like I just don't really know like how to get started, and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say. And it's like, well, you probably need to go back and talk to this person about this.
Yeah.
Because your job is basically to help them help you.
Right. Exactly. Make it as easy as possible for them to help you, which leads really to the next point, which is what do you need to give them so that they can help you? So you shouldn't just give them nothing. They need some sort of materials to go off of. So, what do you think those materials should be?
Well, I think your point about what's your story is a really good one. Mm-hmm. You want, and sometimes, people do this a lot. They'll actually ask you, they'll be like, well, what's your story? What am I trying to convey here? But sometimes you're asking people who don't do this for a living. But, you want to tell them at a minimum sort of what exactly it is that you're applying for. Is it different clerkships? Like if it's clerkships, is it different types of judges? It might be very different depending on which judge you're applying for, or different jobs. You might want different letters for different types of jobs. And I think any materials that you're planning on submitting can be helpful, whether it's a cover letter that kind of lays out your story that you're telling, or if it's an application, your application essays, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And also really what you want this person to focus on, because if you have different recommenders, they might be speaking to different aspects of what you're good at.
Right. So say it was an employer that was writing this letter of recommendation, and one of the things you really wanted them to highlight was the fact that you had client-facing experience in your job.
Right.
It's totally fair, to say, please highlight, my roles and responsibilities, what it was like to work with me, and the fact that, I had client-facing experience, and whether or not you thought I was great at it. So
yeah, hopefully they did think you were great at it if they're writing your letter.
Right, exactly. But, you can, if you're looking for them to present a specific perspective of you, I think you should ask for it. It actually makes the letters a lot easier to write if people tell you what they're looking for.
Oh, absolutely. And I think most people that you ask, if they agree to do it, they want to do a good job.
Right.
But they need your help to get there. Like, no one's clairvoyant, and they might think like, oh, she's asking me because, I can talk about her technical capabilities. And actually you're asking because you want somebody to talk about your client-facing experience. Like that's a disconnect that's not going to present your story in the strongest possible light.
Right.
So, I think whether it's like bullet points or whatever, I think it's absolutely fair to, if there are certain things you would like people to discuss, to suggest that they discuss them.
Yeah, exactly. Again, everybody wants this to work for you, but you're really the person who's driving the bus.
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah, exactly.
This is your project, and you need to make it as easy for this person as possible to, participate in your project.
Yeah, you're steering the ship here.
Yep.
And if you hit an iceberg, well, you're all going to go down with the ship, but it's ultimately going to be your fault.
Should we go for a third transportation metaphor?
It's a unicycle. No, wait, it's a tandem bike.
Exactly.
It's a clown
cable
car. Yeah, and I think also some personal anecdotes and stories always make these more interesting. So if it's, don't just say oh, Lee was really great working with clients. Give an example if they can think of an example of, oh, here's an example of a time where she really went above and beyond, and I got a very nice note from the client thanking her for her amazing work. Mm-hmm. That's going to carry a lot more weight than yeah, Lee was really good at this. It's okay, well, I don't know, was she? Or they're just saying that? All of these letters should be good. Yeah,
it's so true. Can I tell you a funny, totally side note story that I just think is really entertaining? It's when I worked in PR, I was doing a lot of client calls, and I was working in political PR, and one of our clients just never could remember my name and had decided I had a totally different name, it was Pippa or something like that. I mean, it was not even close to Lee. And he would write these notes to my boss about how much he liked working with Pippa.
Your boss is who's Pippa?
Who's Pippa? But it was so funny because we just all thought it was hilarious that, I don't have that complicated of a name, to remember, but there was this phantom assistant that they loved, but it was always my work. And so we just joked that if anything went bad, it was going to be Pippa's fault, not mine.
Yeah, so I guess that's a key thing. Make sure this person knows your name and how to spell it.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember in high school, we had a teacher who was like known for writing just amazing letters of recommendation. And she gave them to us for some reason. I don't know why. But, so everybody like had her write one. And we're like, oh, and you read it and you're like, oh, it's like Allison is so great at this and that. And like she wrote this like thing that was so amazing. And you're like, oh, God, I'm so like, this is the best letter ever. And then you started comparing it with your friends and realized she only had like 3 letters that she just reused and put different names on.
Yeah.
And I realized in that case, she was actually very particular. This is another thing people need to consider when considering who to ask. Sometimes people will not write multiple letters or like only a certain number of letters to the same institution or to the same judge. So sometimes if you get turned down, it's not necessarily it's your fault. It's just that somebody else got there earlier and they're applying to the same judges. And understandably, if you have your one set letter, you don't want to reuse it for like 3 people with the same judge.
Right. And if the judge is your friend from law school as a professor, you can't send in 15 letters of recommendation for a clerkship spot. That would be a little odd, I think.
Yeah. I mean, they're going to have to pick 1 or 2 and be like, this is my best student of the year.
Right.
Yeah, and the other thing is to get people to know or to actually do the stuff, they've got to know exactly what to do. Like, what's the process? If it's a clerkship, your school probably has some way of submitting the letters. If it's law school applications, I think they submit them to LSAC, but whatever it is, it's your responsibility to make sure that you make it as easy as possible, that you send a detailed email or whatever it is. Don't just send them the webpage and be like, here are the instructions. Really walk them through the process of like, this is what you need to do. This is the timing. Let me know if you have any questions or problems or anything like that. Otherwise, they might just well not do it.
Yeah. And if they do have some sort of an assistant or someone like that helping them manage their life, make sure the assistant has a copy of everything too, because it's likely that assistant's going to be the person who's actually submitting the letter.
Yeah, and you want to be friendly with that person.
Yeah.
You might want to get them a coffee occasionally or something.
It's true.
Because you're probably going to end up having to harass them a little bit. And again, like you can't be an entitled asshole about this.
Right.
You need to be you're in a humbling position and you need to act that way with the assistant, because I can guarantee you that whoever's assistant you're dealing with, they talk to the person they work for.
Right.
And they might be willing to do you a favor and go in one day when the person who's going to do your letter happens to be there and seems to be a little bored and maybe has 20 minutes so they can like do this. But you want them on your team.
Yeah, I think that's really true. All right. So what if the person, either the boss or the professor, doesn't really do this very frequently? Perhaps it's a newer professor and they don't have a lot of experience, or someone who's new to a supervisory role. How can you help them figure out what's expected?
Well, I think it's helpful if you can to try to provide some sample letters, or at least at a minimum some guidelines. Like when I got this email from my sister, I was like, well, what is the school asking for? Have you looked at the website to see? I mean, granted, she should not be having to do this.
Right.
But, and so she went and looked. She's like, oh, yeah, they're asking this, they want this. But I think, but she was sort of Googling around on the internet trying to find sample letters. You may not be able to find them, but if you have a model that someone else has used that you think is a good model of just even basic stuff like formatting, or how do you open a letter, or how long should it be, I think providing any guidelines you can is only going to help. Yeah,
I think that's really true. I think it's just important to remember that if somebody agrees to do this for you, it's more likely than not they want to help you and they want to do a good job. So like most things, anything you can do to make their job easier is just going to help you get there.
Yeah, because again, like you want all this stuff to sound harmonious, to sound, if your whole application to law school is about how you want to do public interest work and they're talking about what a great job you did, raising money at the fundraiser, like maybe that's a little incongruous. Maybe not. You can spin that story into like, oh, and this person would be a great leader of an organization because they know how to fundraise.
Right.
But it's got to have the right tone.
Right. Exactly.
You can't be like, yeah, they're the most amazing capitalist I've ever seen. You're like, actually, that's not really what my story is.
No, but we've definitely interviewed plenty of folks who run nonprofits, and you do have to be willing to fundraise. So for the right position, that could actually be a good thing.
Yeah. It's just like they've got to know how to spin it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, here's a question. I've sometimes, heard or been in the situation where someone's like, oh, I'd love to help you out. That sounds great. Total supporter. I don't really have time to do this. Can you write the letter yourself?
Yeah, this is always really awkward.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's not a good idea to write the whole letter yourself. But maybe go back to bullet points and kind of spoon feeding for them a little bit what they want to do to just make their job as easy as possible. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's awkward. I mean, I don't think it's really a totally fair thing for someone to ask. I mean, I think they think they're being helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, it's super awkward, let's face it, to write a letter about yourself.
It is.
How great you are.
Yes.
You know? Maybe you can tag team with some friends and kind of like, come up with something. I mean, ultimately, I think you have to decide, is this a person that you want to have doing your letter? If they're super high profile and they do know you, they just don't feel like dealing with it, and they're willing to sign off on whatever you want. I mean, maybe that's okay. I don't think it's like necessarily an ethical issue or anything like that. But it's just a weird situation.
Yeah.
So I think it's fine too to go to that person and be like, I really appreciate your willingness to do this, but I'd rather actually find somebody else.
Yeah, I think that's totally fine. Or kind of find a middle ground. I could see starting kind of the template, and then, asking them to insert certain anecdotes or specific thoughts, so it would still be faster for them. But I think you have to just decide what you're comfortable with. If you can't write a glowing recommendation about yourself, then that shouldn't be one of your letters of recommendation.
Well, I think it's also just like, it's probably just going to sound weird because it's going to sound like your application essay or whatever, It's going to sound like your cover letter.
Yeah.
That's why I think like bringing somebody else into it to like sort of brainstorm or whatever. I don't know. I think that's an awkward situation to put people into, but it definitely does happen.
It does. Yeah. And then what if people just end up flaking and not doing it at all?
Well, that's disaster waiting to happen.
Right.
I mean, one thing you can do to try to ward that off in advance is if you have a range of letters that you're allowed to submit, go for the higher end of that range.
Yeah, it's true.
If they're like, submit 3 to 5 letters, ask for 5.
Yeah, it's true. And it's not even just because somebody flakes. I mean, crazy stuff happens, illnesses, family stuff, elder parents, like kids get sick. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. And so I think it's always best to hedge your bets and, maybe even ask for that 4th letter, because you may need to call on them to put it in.
Yeah, and I think too, like, you don't want this to be a last minute type of situation where you are not aware that this might be happening, which again goes back to setting those early deadlines. Like, do not tell your recommenders the actual deadline.
Right.
I mean, they might go find out themselves, but don't tell them.
Right.
If your stuff is due January 1st, tell them it's due December 15th.
Yep.
And then ask them for a first draft by December 1st, or ask them to at least have a draft. You don't need to see it, but basically you want to send an email like, hey, I just want to make sure that draft was coming along okay. And if they're not responding and you don't hear from them, at least you have a couple of weeks to try to figure something out.
Yeah. I also think if somebody is like not responding to your emails or you're having a tough time reaching out to them, I do think it's fine, especially if you're in school and this is a professor, to just swing by their office or swing by their assistant's office or desk and just try and find out what's going on. I think it's so easy, one, for emails to get lost in the darkness that can become our inbox. But,
For sure.
But also, if let's say I've put something off, never would happen. I mean, I never put things off.
You're very on top of everything.
I'm totally on top of everything. But, but I flag it and then it just like moves further down my inbox, or it didn't make it on my to-do list. And then maybe a second email comes in and then I'm embarrassed because you haven't gotten the first one and then you don't respond to that one. And then somebody's feeling really neglected, but it's actually just that they're on my mind. I'm just kind of out of it, but if they like send me a quick message or they run into me, I'll be like, oh my gosh, you're totally on my radar. I was just waiting to have something to send back to you. Then that's going to make you like feel so much better about the situation than just sitting there and kind of brooding about why they haven't emailed you back. I think email can be such a tough medium sometimes. Because
I don't think you can rely on email in a situation like this. Like if somebody's not responsive and they haven't done what they said they were going to do, it's time to pick up the phone. It's time to stop by. It's time to get in touch with their assistant. It's, time to send like whatever,
Right.
like you gotta be a little more proactive. The whole point is you've got to be proactive.
Yes.
These are your letters. This is your project. This is your life. And people agreed to help you, but everybody's super busy, and there's a good chance that they're not going to be totally on top of this. And that's just something you need to plan around from the start.
Yep.
And not wait until the last minute to find out that all 4 of your recommenders have decided to leave the country simultaneously and forgotten to write your letters.
Yeah, that's not a good situation to be in. So most things, you have to think ahead, you have to own the process, and it's your responsibility to be organized and be on top of what's going on. So you're not into a situation where you're surprised that nothing got done.
Yeah, you have to nag, but politely.
Yes, because they are busier than you are, even though you think you're super busy. And they're doing you a favor. So.
Exactly. And a lot of people have real life responsibilities. Like if your kid is in the hospital or something, writing a letter of recommendation is probably not at the top of your mind at that point.
No. Yeah. And I think that's something that when I was younger, now I just feel like I'm saying back in my day when, but I didn't really appreciate how, almost anyone we talk to in their 30s and older has some sort of family thing going on, elder parents, kids, pets, home, jobs, spouses, the list goes, on and on and on and on, I think, as we get older. And so you do just have to realize that sometimes, a professor's life might be complicated and they're juggling quite a few things, and be respectful of that.
Yeah. But also, if they agreed to help you, they want to help you. And so follow up, let them help you, make them help you.
Yeah, exactly.
Or at least find out, at some point you may have to ask, look, I really feel like this isn't going to be possible. That's totally fine. I just need to know that.
Right.
And then you figure out what else to do and you scramble.
Exactly. But better scrambling. No, I was just going to say better scrambling than not having a letter of recommendation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately with that, we are out of time. So if you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes, because we would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. Our new episodes come out on Monday. If you have any question or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Sorry, everyone, been a long day. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon, and good luck on those letters of recommendation.